In 2013, I had the privilege of going to Russia for about 2.5 weeks. And during my time there, I was sitting in Russia Bible Church in Moscow when this passage was being preached by the pastor, someone that I've gotten to know now over the past 7 years, Evgeny. And as Evgeny preached from these words, I was struck by the force of the weight of this passage. For the previous 2 weeks, I had been involved with some pastors' and wives' retreats in the greater Moscow area, extending about 300-400 kilometers outside of Moscow. And as I was going around, and as I was doing these pastor retreats, I heard the stories of various individuals, how family had suffered, and they had been so greatly affected by the KGB, that they had been either softly persecuted or there had been family members who had been killed because they were Christians. Even to bear the name Baptist, which in Russia, in broader Russia, to be Baptist is to be evangelical. To be Baptist was like a swear word. It was a word of derision, that if you were to be a Baptist, the general population looked down upon you. And as I was going to the city of Ivanovo, and I was going to do a pastors and wives retreat there. And as I was going there, we suddenly got word that the church where we were hosting the retreat had suddenly been massively inconvenienced by the authorities. That the authorities had come in, and as typical as what they do, they came in and demanded a full investigation of the church's books. And so the pastors and wives retreat had to be delayed by an entire day because just the Christians there, the leaders of the church, had to prepare and had to make arrangements and get all of the books and everything in order for the governing officials. As a result of that, we had to delay our retreat for that full day. And as we just dealt with this difficulty, having the delay, I began to realize that this was a normal part of everyday life experience for Russian believers. And so as I sat in that church, in Russia Bible Church in Moscow, and as I listened to Evgeny preach, and I had my headset on for the translation, and through the broken translation that I was getting, I heard a tone from this passage that really impacted me, where Paul says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." What does that look like? Now for Paul, if you recall that when Paul is writing this letter, it's probably sometime in the late AD 50s, probably 57 or maybe a little bit later. And as he writes this letter, who is the emperor? It's Nero. Now, Nero was a populist emperor. The rich absolutely despised him, and the general working class liked him. He had a tax and spend kind of policy, and he was driven by spending a lot. And so the amount of taxation that Nero had imposed on Roman citizens was often great. He was not known to be the nicest man. He was very cruel, in fact. So cruel was he that when the great fire of Rome broke out in about AD 64, and it burned an entire section of Rome, homes and businesses, it was believed that Nero had instigated this fire. And the purpose that Nero had in this fire was it cleared ground for his enormous palace complex that he would build. But in the midst of having this enormous fire, the Christians were blamed by Nero. They became the scapegoats, that they were the ones who had caused the fire. And as a result, there was a lot of difficulty for Christians in the Roman Empire. This is what it was like to live in Rome. This is when Paul writes and says, "Be subject, every one of you, to the governing authorities." This is the context. This is the time that they're living in. And so I realized as I sat in Russia Bible Church that the experience of my Russian brothers and sisters in Christ was probably far closer to Paul's experience when he wrote Romans than it was my own. And so I realized that I had a lot to learn. And so in this context, I think that we do have several things that we can learn from Romans 13 about our governing authorities and how we respond as Christians to governing authorities. Three things I want us to see this morning. And the first thing I want us to see is that governing authorities are a gift from God. That we ought to see governing authorities as a gift from God. Paul says in verse 1, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Paul uses this language of God being the ultimate authority, the authority of all authorities, and his very nature is that God is a God who has all power, all authority. He is the God who, he's not clamoring for power, he doesn't need to grasp onto it because he has all authority. And in light of that, what is his nature? His nature is a self-giving God. He's the kind of God who gives away. He delegates authority. This is what he does. He gives different spheres of authority. And so these different spheres of authority are representative of the very rule and authority of God. That right, proper use and administration of authority is it's a demonstration of God's rule and reign. So when authority is used properly, it displays our self-giving God. And God gives authority. This is not something that happened after the fall, that because of Adam and Eve's sin, that God then decided, well, it's time for me to delegate authority. No, we see in Genesis 1, beginning even in verses 27 and 28, where Moses writes and he says that God made man in his image and his likeness, male and female, he created them. And he gave them, we're told in verse 28, he gave them authority, he gave them this responsibility to put all of creation under subjection, to have dominion over it, to rule and tend it. They were, if you would, they were vice regents, or they were like prince and princesses of the world, that they had been given this delegated authority to take what God had made and to expand and to flourish the rule and reign of God. But they did not obey God's command. They did not live in subjection to his authority. They rebelled, and everything went into chaos. And the result of that is that authority ever since has been an issue for all human beings in all places and all times. Authority, though, rightly used, is a gift. It's a gift of God. It's intended, we see even in the garden, it's intended to multiply, to expand, to flourish. It's for human good. It's for the common good. And as a result of that, God gives different types of authorities in different spheres. It's important for us to understand that not all authority in every sphere is the same. And so we have government who has the authority to wield the sword, we're told in Romans 13, to keep the peace. We have employers who have an authority to manage a business and to ensure that employees have fruitful and prosperous work that is meaningful and that advances the common good. We have parents who have authority to instruct their children. We have husbands who have been called to nourish their wives. We have elders who are called to tend the flock of God. So we have different spheres of authorities. And all authority, we're told in verse 1, is given by God. It's given out. It's a gift. And second of all, it's instituted by him. And so there's a recognition that there are different spheres with different responsibilities. Now, that doesn't mean that every sphere of authority has the same type of authority. And so it's not the same for an individual to seek justice. It's not our responsibility to avenge evil. In fact, Paul makes that point in Romans 12, verses 17 and following. Just before this passage, when Paul's talking about, now, he's talked about how the governing authorities have the responsibility to wield the sword. What's the responsibility of Christians? Look at chapter 12, verse 17 and following. Paul says, Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So in other words, it's not the individual's responsibility to avenge. That's the state's responsibility, justice. We've got the courts, and the courts are intended to be used in an appropriate means for justice. It's not our responsibility to be having this mob or vigilante style of justice. There's an appropriate means because it's a delegated authority that God has given to the state. The Christian's responsibility is to seek to do good to all. Now, that does not negate the fact that we, as Micah says, we ought to love to show, to do justly and to love mercy. We ought to desire justice. So it doesn't negate justice, but it means that the way that we do that is not by seeking vengeance on our own. And so as a result, God has made it very clear that there are these different spheres of authority because it shows the very nature of our God. Right use of authority displays God's rule in God's way. And God's rule is intended for human flourishing, for the common good. This is why his authority it's not intended to cause us to cringe, but rather it's to cause us to grow into all of his goodness. Now, power, we can think of it in terms of power. Power used in the right way is enormously helpful. We think of electricity, for example, that when you plug something into the wall and you put something in the socket, that device that you're plugging in is intended to make your life somewhat easier, whether it's a blender, a microwave, a fan, whatever it is. The electricity that flows through that cord and powers that device serves you well. But if you use electricity wrongly, you'll get a massive jolt, or maybe worse, death. And in the same way, authority that has been given, it is intended to function for human good. Now, we do need to make one other distinction here that Christians have often made throughout the ages, and that's between the social ethics and personal ethics. And God has designed the state to establish a social ethic, an ethic for the common good. And it comes out of that. But Christians are intended to obey the law of God and exceed the law of the land. Where there are good laws, we intend to exceed the very nature of the goodness of those laws, because we want to be those who live under the authority of King Jesus. Since all authority comes from God, since all authority is delegated by God, that means that God is the ultimate authority. He is the lawgiver. That above the law is the lawgiver. And therefore, because he is the lawgiver, he has the right to designate and delegate that authority for the common good. And so we ought to see authority as a gift from God, especially our governing authorities. The second thing that I want us to see is that we ought to obey our governing authorities as an act of worship. At the very outset of this section, Paul had begun with some very practical instructions in Romans 12, verse 1. In view of the mercies of God, in light of how good and kind he is in rescuing us from sin, in forgiving us, in loving us, no longer condemning us. In light of all of this, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship or service. This is what worship looks like. You give of yourselves. And one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways that we lay down our lives, that we seek to be living sacrifices, is we obey our governing authorities when there are good and just laws. Now, during this season of COVID, we have seen it fit, in light of the limited information we had at the very start of this pandemic, in light of the chaos that was erupting around the globe with limited knowledge and information and data, when our governing officials asked us, in fact instructed us, not to gather, we as elders met and we agreed that this is the right thing to do out of love for God and love for neighbor. That we weren't being targeted or singled out, but rather as the entire economy was being closed down, it was right for us to protect one another, to love one another. We gladly submitted to this as a church because the government is given the responsibility of life and death. That's what Paul lays out here. It's their responsibility. Life and death is in their hands. They can wield the sword. They can execute wrath. But it's intended for the common good. It's intended to protect the citizenry. And so in light of that, it wasn't as though churches were being singled out or people of faith, because the entertainment industry is still shut down, and sports, the billion-dollar industry of sports, is crippled by this economic shutdown, where there's still no active engagement in sports. And you have to think that it's not just targeted at Christians or at people of faith, but rather there was a genuine concern in the early days with limited knowledge and data to protect the citizenry. And so we gladly submitted. As time went on, it became right, as more information became available, to ask questions and to probe and to consider, what does it mean that we're shut down, and how long does this exist, and how can we then be the people of God? We were not prohibited from preaching the gospel. We were not prohibited from live streaming. We're in a day and an age where we can do so much. We can speak to you through this camera here and talk to you at home and serve you. And so there was no limitation in terms of the proclamation of the gospel. We still had that freedom. But because the government is given the responsibility of life and death, we recognize, as Paul says, that this power that the government has is as a, you see it in verse 6, a minister, God's minister. The government is intended, verse 4, to carry out the wrath of God. That you have no reason to fear if you are obeying or exceeding the expectations of good laws. You have no reason to fear. So, when you're sitting at a stoplight and a police car pulls up beside you, do you have any reason to worry what's going to happen after you leave the light? No. You're sitting there, you're fully abiding by the law, the police car is there. You have no concerns whatsoever. But if you're driving down the road, 10, 20, maybe a bit more over the speed limit, and you see a police car, what do? Where do you first look? Your eyes drop from the police car down to the speedometer. And the next instinct is your foot lifts up off of the gas pedal. Or maybe, if you're going a little too fast, it moves from the gas to the brake. And why is that? Because we know that the delegated authority that God has given to the state through police, for example, that they can whip around, turn on the lights, pull us over, and fine us if we are exceeding the speed limit because we're not being safe. We're putting others at risk, and we're not respecting the law. And this is the reason Paul says, you have no reason to fear good governing authorities when you're obeying the law. When it's good and just laws, you have no reason to fear. But you do have reason to fear when you are not following the law. That's the authority that God has given to the state. It's for the common good, the restraining of evil. Now, all authority, as it's been given by God, it has its limits. It's in its sphere. And that authority is intended to function within its specific sphere. So, for example, it is not the job of the elders of a church to be dealing with criminal matters in a way that the courts are intended to do that. That begins to move outside of the sphere of what the elders of a church are intended to do in shepherding the flock of God. In the same way, it is not the state's job to discipline a person who is wayward in faith. That's not their responsibility. We recognize the different spheres that God gives to different authorities. But there are times, because of human sinfulness, where authority goes beyond its God-ordained limits. And when that happens, when there is a breach of the use of the power, it often becomes an abusive type of a power or an authoritarian type of power. And this is where, when the law of God and the law of man become into conflict, where we are told that we must obey the law of the land, but it calls us to disobey God, then that's where we hear the words of Peter in Acts 5, verse 29. We must obey God rather than man. There is a time for civil disobedience, and it's recognizing when that takes place. Now, there are times where it's abundantly clear, where there is a very clear line that has been crossed because the spheres of authority have been crossed. But most of the time, that is a blurry line. And it just doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. And so it takes wisdom, it takes discernment, it takes prayer, and not a quick reaction. Now, yesterday was the 4th of July for our dear friends south of the border. And it's a day where they celebrate their independence. Because on July 4th of 1776, Congress came together and declared its independence from King George III and the British rule. And in light of that, the American Declaration of Independence laid out 27 grievances that they had with the Crown. They had seen that there had been an overreach of authority by the governing officials. And so they had pointed to unjust laws, how the king had opposed good laws for the colonies, how there had been excessive taxation, and how there had been structures that oppressed the common good of the colonies. And in light of these things, in light of the 27 declarations of grievance that they had against the Crown, the American Declaration of Independence says that when there is poor governance, it is the responsibility of humans to establish good governance. So there is a point, there is a time when an abuse of authority needs to be corrected, and where it needs to be even disobeyed. But that is done with great time, with conversations, with wisdom, with prayer. And it's not done reactionary. It's done very intentionally and deliberately. For the most of our Western civilization, we have had good governance. Now, regardless of what you think of the current state of politics in North America, you can honestly say that for the most part, we enjoy many good freedoms. The freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, the freedom to gather. We do have these, and in fact, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, they are enshrined in the very first article of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a country. And because of that, we have this privilege that we can do a lot with the privileges that God has given us. And we ought to steward this season of freedom in a way that we can proclaim the gospel, that we can encourage and gather together. But there is one area where I want us to think about how we can continue to improve. When Paul says at the end of this passage, he says, where respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. At the very end of verse 7, there is something that we need to continually think about in this social media age. It's very easy in this social media age to post memes or to put up posts online to express our extreme displeasure not only over policies but over persons. Now, I've not hidden my uncomfortableness with President Donald Trump, that there have been many immoral things that I'm deeply troubled by, that character matters in the office of president. But even though there are aspects about his character, there is some sort of dignity that, because the office has a dignity and an authority given by God, that we ought to speak in a way that respects the dignity and authority of the office. That we ought to be careful in how we speak, that we're not attacking the person, but addressing the problems of an idea. That we honor our elected officials, and that we do so in a way that shows that we do respect authority, even when we disagree, even when the character of the person who is in office doesn't reflect the values that we have. That we don't have to like everything that Justin Trudeau does, both in terms of public policy or in terms of his private actions, to still respect the office of the Prime Minister. And we ought to show that kind of respect in our speech, thanking God for Mayor Ina DeViet and Mayor Ed Holder. We ought to thank God for Premier Doug Ford and for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We ought to be good citizens of Canada, who honor our government and give the respect to the office that is due because it has been given by God. Now, that does not mean that we don't question policies, that we challenge ideas, but that we respect authority. And we do so in a way that shows that all authority has been given by God. So, we see authority as a gift. Second, we obey authority as worship. And the third thing, though it doesn't come from this passage, Paul makes it very clear in 1 Timothy 2, the third thing is that we ought to pray for governing authorities for justice. Now, Paul will say in 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and following, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." We ought to pray for a peaceful and quiet life. Now, there are some who believe that it is good for the church to go through persecution. Look at how the church has flourished in persecution. The church needs to be purified in the West. It's become corrupt, or it's lost its way. And though those things are true, we are not commanded to pray for persecution. We are commanded to pray for our governing officials so that we can live peaceful and quiet lives. That we understand that as we pray for a good government, a just government, it gives us opportunity to proclaim the gospel, to gather together. It's for the common good. It's for human flourishing. So we dare not pray, "Oh God, send persecution." We recognize that God builds His church through persecution, but we ought to pray that we can live peaceful, quiet lives. This is for our godliness. This is for our good. And it's for the spread of the gospel, as Paul says here in verse 3 of 1 Timothy 2, that all men would come to this knowledge of the truth. That's what we ought to pray for. That's what we ought to live for. We ought to live for a just society. We ought to live for a peaceful society. That's what we long for. And we ought to pray for governing officials because we desire the right administration of authority and of justice. Our governing officials have incredibly complex tasks before them. How do you uphold competing interests, competing rights? How do you hold those things together? How do you respect, for example, how do you respect the patent of a drug company who is investing enormous amounts of dollars in research and development to, let's say, come up with a vaccine for this COVID-19? And yet at the same time, how do you promote the common good that you're going to need this drug administered or this vaccine? It's going to need to be replicated and duplicated around the world in enormous numbers. How do you respect a patent and at the same time seek the common good of a vaccine for all those who are open to and needing a vaccine? There are complicated issues there. And we need to pray that our governing officials can both encourage private enterprise and at the same time encourage public health. They're not two different things, but they often feel like they're in competition. And in light of that, we ought to pray for our government. We ought to pray, how can they use taxes best? Now there are some Christians who say, all taxation is theft by government. But Paul makes it very clear here in Romans 13, verses 6 and 7. No, taxation is actually something rightly administered and rightly used that the government is called to do. Now, there are times where there is excessive taxation, but we ought to pray that our government can use taxation for the common good, for building roads and health care and education. We ought to pray that our governing authorities are able to use taxation in a good way, tax in a right way. But we also recognize that there is always an enormous temptation when anyone has power. There is always an enormous temptation, a temptation to be self-serving, a temptation to abuse that power. As I sat in that church in Moscow, and as I listened to Pastor Evgeny preach on Romans 13, and as the stories of Christians that I had met and heard were going through my mind of being persecuted, churches being shut down, Christians being disadvantaged in workplaces, I realized I had so much to learn about what it means to live in subjection to the governing authorities. For there were brothers and sisters, Russian brothers and sisters, using their gifts, reaching out to those in need, serving one another, caring for the disadvantaged, doing the work of ministry. Jesus, we remember this, under the most unjust act in human history, under a government that did not act rightly in using its authority, Jesus was sent to a cross. And in one of the greatest acts of evil and the abuse of political power, it has resulted in our salvation and our good. And even today, Jesus is building his church. Jesus is giving gifts. Jesus is strengthening you and me. Jesus has given a mission. Jesus has called us to go. And though it may look a little different in times of trial and persecution versus times of flourishing and freedom, the things that Jesus is doing, they are still the same. And he has given us this commission. He has given us this call. He is working for our good. He is strengthening us, building his church so that we might go and declare how great he is, because we have a God who reigns. And because he reigns, we have great confidence that he will accomplish his purposes.